The gavel had barely touched the desk when the entire courtroom froze, not because of the judge, but because Jasmine Crockett refused to bow. In that instant, something shifted in the air. The wooden panels of the chamber seemed to creak louder, the murmurs of attorneys and clerks fell silent, and the echo of that gavel became less a sound of authority than a warning that authority itself was about to be tested. All eyes turned toward her, though no one dared move. Judge Richard Leon leaned forward from the bench, a man accustomed to deference, to the gravity of his own presence. Yet on his face, for the first time in years, flickered something foreign: hesitation. What could one sentence do to stop a federal judge in his tracks? That was the question no one knew they were about to witness answered. Crockett's eyes never wavered. They carried the weight of someone who had lived too many moments of condescension, too many dismissals, too many reminders of where power pretends it belongs. She stood there, not as a supplicant but as a challenger, steady, measured, unafraid. The very way she inhaled before speaking drew the room tighter, like a bowstring pulled to its edge. Leon cleared his throat, preparing to continue with the usual cadence of judicial ritual. But he didn't. He couldn't, because Crockett's refusal to bend was louder than any declaration he could make. A silence spread, contagious, gripping even the court stenographer who momentarily forgot to type. It was in that silence that her words prepared to land, and when they did not sound like an argument. They sounded like judgment. Not the judge's judgment, but the kind that rises from truth unshaken by titles or robes. By the end, even the court couldn't deny. Power had just been humbled. The audience didn't yet know how. They didn't yet know what line she would deliver, what challenge would flip the weight of authority upside down. But they felt it bone deep. That something irreversible was beginning. The kind of beginning that makes history pause for breath, and once spoken, her words would leave that room and echo far beyond it. The courtroom was not just a room. It was an arena. Every polished surface, every stack of briefs, every seal of the United States carved into the wood above the bench was meant to remind those inside of who held power here. The walls didn't merely enclose the space, they pressed down, suffocating those who dared to stand at the wrong side of the law. In that chamber, truth was supposed to submit to procedure, and procedure belonged to the judge. For years, Judge Richard Leon embodied that truth. His reputation reached beyond the marble halls of Washington, beyond the legal journals and casebooks. Lawyers whispered his name with equal parts respect and fear, because his authority was not a question. It was an axiom. He was the kind of figure who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. His robe was more than fabric, it was armor, woven from decades of rulings, citations, and a cultivated air of inevitability. He was the system standing tall in human form, immovable, untouchable, or so everyone thought. And then there was Jasmine Crockett. To some, she seemed out of place, an unlikely challenger walking into a chamber that had swallowed many before her. She wasn't supposed to unsettle the foundations of the courtroom. She wasn't supposed to shift the weight of centuries-old deference. She was supposed to play her part, measured, polite, deferential. Yet, even as she took her position at the table, the tension in the room changed. It wasn't bravado, it was clarity. She knew the risks. She knew the eyes that would roll, the smirks that would follow. But she also knew that truth doesn't tremble even in the shadow of giants. This was not just about a single legal motion or a technical ruling. To Jasmine, the stakes reached far higher than precedent or statute. This was about accountability, about the audacity to confront authority when authority had long forgotten what it means to answer back. If she yielded, it would be one more silent defeat, one more chapter where power escaped unchallenged. But if she stood firm, it would become a story not of law, but of courage. Every spectator in the room believed they knew how this performance would end. They had seen the script before: the judge commands, the advocate concedes, the record records, and the system rolls on without a scratch. Authority remains authority. Yet Crockett was not reading from that script. Her eyes scanned the chamber, absorbing its weight, and in that glance, there was no sign of collapse. She was not here to survive, she was here to expose. Leon, seated high above, could not yet recognize the danger. He leaned back, comfortable in the patterns of obedience he had cultivated. But beneath his composure was a silence he had not invited, a waiting that did not belong to him. It belonged to her. The room thought they knew how it would end, until she spoke. And when she did, the balance of power that had stood unquestioned began to tremble. Not because she shouted, not because she defied for the sake of spectacle, but because her very presence challenged the myth that authority is eternal. In that moment, the courtroom ceased being a place of mere legal argument. It became a battleground where truth itself stood against power, and the outcome was no longer certain. Richard Leon was not a man who rose through charisma or theatrics. His power was colder, quieter, forged in the steady weight of decades behind the bench. Seniority had hardened him, his rulings etched into the architecture of Washington's legal memory. Clerks rotated through his chambers like soldiers through a barracks, each learning the same lesson in his courtroom. There was no space for hesitation. He prided himself on efficiency, on control, on the command of silence, and for years, silence obeyed him. Attorneys dreaded his questions, not for their volume but for their precision. A single raised eyebrow could unravel an argument. A clipped rebuke could make seasoned litigators shrink in their suits. He carried an aura that stretched beyond his bench. It preceded him like a shadow into every case. Judges are meant to embody impartiality, but Leon embodied something heavier, inevitability. When he ruled, the gavel was less punctuation than prophecy. He had silenced hundreds before. Lawyers, witnesses, advocates. All had felt the suffocating pause of his authority pressing down until words withered in their throats. Yet silence, the tool he wielded with mastery, was about to become his downfall. Because silence only serves power when it is fear that fills the void. On this day, in this courtroom, silence belonged to someone else. It would not be Leon's weapon but his mirror, reflecting the arrogance he had polished over the years. And when Jasmine Crockett stood against him, that mirror cracked. The very control he had perfected was the ground about to slip beneath him. What he had always counted on, deference, compliance, silence, would betray him, leaving him exposed before the one thing he could never gavel away: truth. Jasmine Crockett did not enter the courtroom with the armor of seniority or the shield of pedigree. She carried something different, something sharper. The fire of a woman long underestimated, and the clarity of someone who had nothing left to fear. Where others saw the imposing figure of Richard Leon and shrank, she saw only another barrier waiting to be broken. Her reputation outside these walls already spoke of defiance. She was known for speaking when silence was safer, for pushing when retreat was expected. That fire was not recklessness, it was resolve. Born from years of watching injustice disguise itself as procedure. Every word she carried into this chamber was sharpened by that history. For Jasmine, this was never just about winning a point of law. It was about dignity. Hers, and by extension everyone who had been told to sit down, stay quiet, and accept the weight of authority as if it were fate. She knew the stakes were larger than the record. If she faltered, it would be read as proof that even the boldest voices could be bent. But if she held her ground, even for a moment, it would send a tremor through the foundation of unquestioned power. That is why the audience leaned in without knowing why. She wasn't just an attorney, a lawmaker, or a woman in the spotlight. She was a stand-in for every spectator who had ever clenched their fists in silence, wishing they could answer back. She carried their weight, their unspoken defiance, and she made it visible. In a chamber where authority expected submission, Jasmine Crockett arrived not to bow, but to stand, and in that act alone, she was already rewriting the story. The first exchange began almost casually, the way a storm starts with a breeze. Judge Richard Leon tilted his head, his voice clipped, sharp enough to cut through the quiet. "Counselor," he said, his tone carrying the weight of a man used to obedience, "your position rests on assumptions that are not legally sustainable. Do you concede this?" It was the kind of question meant not to invite dialogue, but to impose submission. For years, others had crumbled at that voice, stumbling over explanations, offering apologies, shrinking until the inevitable gavel ended their arguments. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She leaned forward, her voice steady, her words measured like arrows drawn one at a time. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I concede nothing. Because nothing in my position rests on assumption. What I have rests on fact." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Leon's eyes narrowed. He pressed again, sharper this time. "So you're saying my interpretation of precedent is wrong?" He expected hesitation, an apology wrapped in legal jargon. What he got was clarity. "I'm saying, Judge, that precedent is not a shield against accountability. It is a guide, and when it's used as armor to block truth, it stops serving justice." Gasps, faint but audible, broke the silence. Leon's jaw tightened. He shifted in his seat, no longer the immovable figure of authority, but a man suddenly aware of eyes studying him, waiting to see if he could silence her the way he always had before. He tried again, pivoting, dressing his challenge in the language of reason. "Counselor, you are dangerously close to overstepping the respect this court requires." The words dripped with warning, a velvet glove over the fist of authority. Crockett's reply cut through like steel. "With respect, Your Honor, I was taught that respect is not demanded, it is earned." This court earns it when it pursues truth, not when it punishes those who speak it. The gallery shifted, and the tension visible now. A few heads turned eyes wide, as though the unthinkable had just happened. Someone had spoken to Richard Leon without trembling. The silence he had always commanded no longer belonged to him. Leon attempted a different tactic, sliding into subtle gaslighting. Perhaps you are too emotionally invested in this case to separate passion from principle. That is understandable, but not acceptable. It was a dismissal, a framing meant to undermine not her argument but her very presence, reducing her to over-emotional, irrational, unfit to stand toe-to-toe with him. Crockett didn't let the insult linger. She caught it mid-air, turned it back, and sharpened it. If holding power accountable is called emotional, then perhaps emotion is exactly what this courtroom needs, because principle without courage is just complacency wearing a robe. The words landed like a gavel of their own. The audience froze. Even those who disagreed with her felt the weight of it, the audacity, the precision. Later, one observer would write online, she didn't flinch once. Not when he pressed, not when he mocked, not when he tried to twist her fire into weakness. She stood there, calm as stone, sharp as glass. Leon's face betrayed a flicker of frustration. For the first time, the man who silenced hundreds seemed the one searching for footing. Each attempt to corner her dissolved under her precision, each effort to box her and left him exposed. What had once been a courtroom ritual, judge towering, counsel bending, had turned into something else entirely, a duel of wills, where every parry, every counterstroke, revealed the cracks in authority. By the time Leon leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk, the atmosphere had shifted. The gavel no longer hung as a threat. The silence no longer answered him. It answered her. And yet, the clash was only beginning. At first, Judge Richard Leon tried to cloak his irritation beneath the folds of formality. His questions came wrapped in legal phrasing, draped in precedent, and padded with references that sounded immovable. Yet as the minutes stretched, the threads began to unravel. He contradicted himself, small slips at first, one ruling cited to justify authority, then brushed aside when it failed to suit his narrative. He pressed her on timelines only to later dismiss the very importance of timing. The gallery caught it. A shuffle of papers, a side glance, the quiet stir of people who recognized the wobble in a man long thought unshakable. Crockett saw it too, and her composure never wavered. If Leon was iron, she was water, calm, fluid, but relentless in its erosion. Each contradiction he offered, she dismantled with precision. Respectfully, Your Honor, she said after one such slip, either precedent matters, or it does not. But it cannot matter only when convenient. Justice doesn't bend to preference. The words stung because they rang true. A faint cough echoed from the back row, followed by a silence thicker than before. Leon cleared his throat, shifting in his chair, forcing his voice to carry authority. But authority delivered with strain sounded less like law and more like defensiveness. His frustration slipped into sharper edges. Counselor, your argument borders on reckless disregard for this court's process. Crockett's reply came smooth, measured, tinged with razor-wire sarcasm. If exposing contradictions is reckless, then perhaps the process itself is more fragile than we care to admit. The gallery reacted. A ripple of surprise, some faces lit with awe, others wide with disbelief that anyone would dare twist the judge's language back against him. Every word turned the judge's strength into weakness. What had once been his hammer of control now served as an anvil for her precision. Leon tried again, this time aiming at her credibility. Your insistence suggests a personal grievance. Counselor, do you claim this is about more than the law? The bait hung in the air, a trap designed to paint her as emotional, biased, too invested. Crockett stepped into it, and disarmed it with a smile that was both cool and cutting. Of course it's about more than the law, Your Honor. It's about justice. And the last time I checked, law without justice is just paperwork. The sentence landed heavily. Pens froze mid-scribble. The court reporter's fingers paused an instant too long before catching up. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder in the pause that followed. Leon's lips pressed tight, the twitch of a man unused to being outmaneuvered. The contradictions grew sharper. He cited a previous ruling, only for Crockett to expose its context, showing how his interpretation twisted the intent. He accused her of selective reading, and she answered by reciting the passages verbatim, her voice steady, deliberate, each word an unassailable blade. The more he pushed, the more his bias bled into the open, until his frustration was no longer hidden but painted across his expression for all to see. In the gallery, doubt grew. Whispers slid through rows, not loud enough to be scolded but heavy enough to be felt. People leaned forward, sensing a shift they couldn't fully articulate. The feeling of a giant stumbling, of a wall cracking. They had come expecting to see Crockett endure a lecture. Instead, they watched her expose the fissures in the very authority meant to silence her. And still she did not gloat. Her voice carried no triumph, only clarity. That restraint made it cut deeper. Where Leon grew sharper, she grew steadier. Where he rose in volume, she lowered hers, forcing the room to listen harder, drawing every ear closer, commanding attention not through force but through gravity. At one point, his voice snapped. "Counselor, you will not grandstand in this courtroom." She answered, without raising her tone. "Your Honor, I don't need to grandstand. The contradictions speak louder than I ever could." A few gasps escaped before silence reclaimed the air. Leon shifted his papers, fumbling slightly as though to reset the scene, to reassert control. But the more he tried, the more it slipped. Authority, once absolute, now looked defensive, cornered, exposed. Crockett pressed forward, not with aggression but with precision. Each word she chose struck at the soft underbelly of his contradictions. If the law bends one way today and another tomorrow, then it is not law we follow, but whim, and whim has no place in justice. The phrase lingered, a condemnation without raising her voice, a reminder that what was unraveling here was not just a judge's composure but the illusion that power equals correctness. The tension in the chamber thickened. The gallery no longer watched a routine exchange but a dismantling slow and undeniable. People shifted in their seats, breath held, waiting for the next blow, the next revelation, the next moment when silence would fall heavy again. Leon's frustration cracked into visible irritation. His questions lost their polish, his tone sharper, more personal. He accused her of wasting the court's time. She answered by reminding him that time spent on truth is never wasted. He accused her of misrepresenting facts. She recited the record line by line, until his protest shrank under the weight of evidence. Sarcasm bled into her precision, not overplayed but wielded like a scalpel. "Perhaps the record is inconvenient, Your Honor. But inconvenience is not the same as irrelevance." The gallery stirred again, sensing the shift not just in words but in tone. The judge no longer towering, the advocate small. Instead, they appeared as equals in combat, with the balance leaning toward her calm certainty over his faltering control. Every contradiction he offered, she turned. Every trap he set, she sidestepped. And with each turn, the inevitability of his authority dimmed. By now, the silence in the courtroom was no longer his to command. It belonged to her, to the space her words carved open, to the gravity of a duel that had left even the most seasoned observers stunned. And then, at the very moment when Leon attempted once more to corner her, pressing, interrupting, layering his questions with frustration rather than law, she paused. Not rushed, not rattled. She paused, letting the silence stretch until every eye in the room was on her, waiting. The anticipation was unbearable. What would she say? How would she answer? And then came the question that froze the room. The silence stretched taut as wire, until Jasmine Crockett finally spoke. Her voice carried no tremor, no haste. "Just a single steady line, Your Honor. If the truth unsettles this court, then perhaps it isn't me on trial, but the very idea of justice itself." The words struck with the force of a verdict. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The gallery froze mid-motion, pens suspended above paper. The court reporter's hands halted, as though language itself had been stunned into stillness. Judge Richard Leon, the man whose presence had once filled every inch of the chamber, leaned back as though the air had been knocked from him. His gavel rested unused, his authority hanging unspoken, brittle, exposed. A gasp rose, scattered yet undeniable, from the audience, not outrage, the kind of sound that escapes when something irreversible has just happened. It wasn't just a clever turn of phrase, it was a mirror held up to power, reflecting fragility where invincibility had once been assumed. Leon's lips parted as if to respond, but no words arrived. His reputation had been built on silencing with sharp retorts, but against Crockett's calm declaration, every instinct faltered. To speak now would only confirm the very weakness she had revealed. The silence thickened into a spectacle of its own. What had been a courtroom felt more like a stage, and the balance of scale had flipped before everyone's eyes. Leon seemed smaller now, swallowed by the very bench that once made him untouchable. Crockett, standing firm, seemed to grow taller, her presence magnified by the weight of her restraint. She had not raised her voice, yet she commanded the room. The audience leaned in, not to witness a clash, but to witness a transformation. What had been tension born of conflict turned into awe born of recognition. They weren't just watching a lawyer spar with a judge. They were witnessing truth pierce the armor of authority. And in that moment, the truth appeared unstoppable. Whispers began at the back, hushed but electric. She said it. She really said it. Did you see his face? The words carried a current, a validation of what everyone felt but could barely articulate. that a line had been crossed and the power dynamics they thought unshakable had been rewritten. Leon shifted in his seat, searching for footing, for some shred of the dominance that had defined his career. But each movement looked smaller, each glance more uncertain. Against Crockett's immovable calm, he seemed not a titan, but a man caught in the exposure of daylight. Crockett did not press further. She didn't need to. Triumph wasn't in piling on, but in knowing the battle was already won. Her silence after the line was its own declaration, the kind that echoes louder than any speech. The moral polarity had flipped. The figure who had embodied authority now looked fragile, diminished, while the one who entered, underestimated, stood undeniable, luminous in the clarity of her defiance. The gallery felt it too, a collective recognition that they had just witnessed more than an argument. They had seen power humbled. And though no verdict had been rendered, though no official word had been spoken, the outcome felt sealed. The triumph wasn't in paperwork or rulings. It was in the simple, stunning fact that one voice had turned the weight of the bench into silence. Truth had spoken and power had no answer. The gavel finally fell, but it no longer sounded like command. It sounded like retreat. Judge Richard Leon adjourned the session with a stiffness that betrayed more than formality. He left the bench swiftly, his robe trailing behind him like a shadow shrinking in daylight. What lingered wasn't his authority, but her words. The chatter erupted the moment he exited. People leaned across benches, whispering as if they had just witnessed history. One juror muttered under his breath, "I'll never forget that line." A clerk shook her head, wide-eyed, telling anyone who would listen, "I've never seen him silenced, not once, until today." By evening, the echo of the moment had already leapt beyond the courtroom walls. Headlines raced each other across the digital skyline. Crockett freezes Leon with one line. Power humbled in real time. Clips surfaced on social media, replayed in loops that magnified her calm and his silence. The video of her words spread like wildfire, captioned with phrases like, "This is how you stand up to power, truth has a face, and it looks like Jasmine Crockett." Comment sections transformed into arenas of validation. Thousands typed the same sentiment in different ways. "She spoke for us." Some recalled moments they had felt powerless at work, in school, in their own families. Moments where authority pressed down and silence seemed the only option. Crockett had cracked that silence. She had given shape to defiance without arrogance, courage without cruelty. Analysts on nightly broadcasts replayed the moment frame by frame. Some marveled at her composure, others at Leon's unraveling. One commentator said, almost reverently, "She didn't just defend a case. She defended belief itself. The belief that truth can still win in rooms built to silence it. And in living rooms, on subway commutes, in late-night text chains between friends, people carried that sentence with them like a torch. The line became more than rhetoric, it became shorthand for hope. Crockett herself remained silent to reporters as she left the courthouse, her eyes steady, her steps unhurried. But in that silence lay a victory louder than applause. She didn't need to explain what everyone had already felt. She had changed the air in that courtroom. And once air changes, it cannot return to what it was. For those who watched, the catharsis was undeniable. They felt vindicated, as though her triumph had folded their own small struggles into something larger, something victorious. She was not just a lawyer winning an argument, she was a reminder that courage, when spoken with clarity, can still topple giants. And long after the cameras switched off and the hashtags cooled, one truth remained unshaken in that courtroom. Belief had been defended, and belief had won. Judge Richard Leon wasn't just amazed. He was humbled by truth that unfolded in that courtroom wasn't a legal skirmish. It was a moment of history. Jasmine Crockett's defense didn't just dismantle an argument, it dismantled the illusion that authority is untouchable. Her words froze the air, and for the first time, silence belonged not to the judge, but to the truth. Online, people called it the coldest clapback of the year. Clips replayed endlessly. Each shares a stamp of collective awe. Viewers around the world recognize the power of that moment, one voice standing calm, precise, and unafraid against decades of precedent and intimidation. It became more than courtroom drama. It became cultural testimony, and now, the question passes to you: if you were in that courtroom, whose side would you have been on? Would you have bowed to the weight of authority, or stood with the courage to challenge it? This isn't just commentary, it's a movement of belief, a defense of truth itself. Subscribe now, because the next defense might shake power again, and you won't want to miss the moment when silence breaks.